Wade Jodun.
Thank you so much, folks. This is not my first trip here. I worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for 21 years. A few years ago, if you might recall, the fish hatchery here in Warren it had a bacterial infection. We dried it up for 3 years. It was me that they brought in to oversee the retrofit of that hatchery. We put in a new water treatment tower. We redid the raceways. We covered those raceways to keep birds out of them. We re-roofed a lot of buildings. And so I was overseeing the retrofit of that hatchery, so I spent a number of weeks and nights here in Warren. I also want to make mention while I'm here, I am so glad to see that we've assembled in this building. We did nine town hall events, and 6 of them were in volunteer fire calls. We did that, 1, because I'm a volunteer firefighter, but 2, this is what my vision of government looks like. Nobody asks the men and women who come here to volunteer whether they're Democrats or Republicans. And not one time when that engine that sits in the other room over here pulls up in front of a house do those men and women get off that engine and ask, does this house belong to a Democrat or does it belong to a Republican? It is the true spirit of public service. They run into harm's way without a salary. They suffer higher incident rates of cancer than almost anyone in the working world. I am so glad that it's here, because this is what my vision of government looks like. This, if our elected representatives acted with half as much community spirit and integrity as the men and women that occupy these volunteer firehouses, we would be light years ahead as a nation.
Amen to that.
Yes.
So I thought I'd tell you a bit about myself, where we are today, where I think we can go, and why I think I'm the person to get you there. I grew up in rural Clinton County, 700 people in the town of Mill Hall. I now live in Center County. My father worked for a grocery store for 46 years. My mom worked for Walmart. My mom worked for a bakery. We did not have a lot of money growing up. There were difficult times. I know they struggled to pay the bills. I know they struggled to put food on the table. But despite that, my parents gave me the greatest education in the world. Through their own actions, they taught me the need to reinvest in your own community. Dad, volunteer leader of the community park. 20 years he's been a borough councilman. He also was the past president of Mill Hall Youth League. I watched my mother over the last 20 years on the street that she lives as 3 of her neighbors were diagnosed with terminal illnesses. My mom would go over in the summer and mow their yards. She'd clean off their sidewalks in the winter, and every night she cooked them a meal so that they had food on the table. I learned that lesson. Myself, 15 years of volunteer Little League umpire. I tell you, if politicians need a thick skin, I developed it on the Little League fields of Center and Clinton County. Also a volunteer Little League coach, a volunteer firefighter, 4,000 hours of volunteer time in my community while I was going to college. They also taught me the value of hard work. I remember my father at one point in his life working for Wise Markets, working for Renninger's Lumber Company, and serving weekends in the National Guard. That lesson never escaped me. But the lesson they taught me that was probably most important is you do the right thing. Not sometimes, not when it's convenient, not when it's politically correct. You do the right thing, and it's most important to do the right thing when it's hard. It was a lesson that served me well, because in my 15th year with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, I was ordered to falsify hurricane damage estimates. I was told, you will make a choice. You will falsify these estimates and pick the pocket of the American taxpayer, or we will end your career. And I remembered the lessons of my parents, and I said, hell no. 6 years, 2 federal investigations, covered under federal whistleblower law, won both investigations, and I came to discover something. You can be on the side of right, you can win the battles, and you can still lose the war. I also learned during that 6 years what it's like to be alone. I was never allowed to be in a union because inside the federal government they classify 97% of all positions management. They make unions tiny so they can't be effective. They don't require union members, even the few that they do have, to pay union dues. We had 31 union members in the entire northeastern United States, and only 5 of them paid union dues. I took a butt kicking every day in that office because I didn't have a union to support me. I also learned that politicians aren't going to be there for you either. I reached out to political leaders from both parties, and I said, give me 5 minutes of your time so I can tell you my story, because you deserve to understand the way waste, fraud, abuse, and corruption take place inside the government, and not one sitting politician from either party would give me 5 minutes face to face. I ran this campaign because I think that what government is supposed to do is make sure that the people who are doing the right thing, working hard, on the side of right and struggling, are never left alone. Never left alone, and we have been left alone way, way too long. All right, you've got sitting Representative Glenn Thompson, who promises that he is a friend of agriculture, but when Susan Bozier and I go to the Pomona Grange legislative dinner 15 miles from his backyard, he doesn't show up. He wouldn't help a rural fire company get themselves registered inside the federal government just so they could compete for a FEMA grant. He wouldn't give me 5 minutes of his time as a federal whistleblower. I ask you, what in the hell is he doing?
The answer is he's taking care of himself and his big donors.
Even a Republican on the street told me I think he's a $165,000 piece of meat who pulls a lever. And I can't agree more. You know, when I drove up here today, I came through the Allegheny Forest. Glenn talks about the fact that he is on the side of the environment. I sat inside the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service a few years ago when he wrote a one-page piece of legislation that would have stripped your Allegheny National Forest of every environmental protection it had under federal law, would have stripped that forest to the ground. Clear-cut it, fracked it. Then he claims to be an environmentalist. He claims that he's in favor of clean water, except he votes to allow coal-top sludge and debris to go into our waters. Now, he says, I'm supporting the Reclaim Act, which will clean up Pennsylvania waterways. And it's a good act. We need to do it. But the fact that he is still allowing our waters to be polluted, look, if you're a volunteer firefighter, you don't get credit for putting out a fire you started. It doesn't work that way. So, you know, so going around this district, and it is a huge district, we have heard a series of things. First and foremost, it is time to get money out of politics. All right, we cannot have an honest discussion about anything. You want to talk about the opioid crisis? $46 million to 64,000 doctors from big pharmaceutical companies to push opioids to the point that we have 260 million prescriptions in 2016 in a country with 320 million people, and not one big pharmaceutical company processed or prosecuted like the damn drug dealers they are, because $55 million a year goes from big pharma into federal election campaigns. You can't talk about fixing the climate when Koch brothers and big oil are funding votes from the Republican Party. We have to get money out of politics. You don't have a voice if there's money in politics. The history of this country is we walked away. We committed treason by signing the Declaration of Independence because we had taxation without representation. And I tell you today, we're right there. Yep. We are right there. They are not listening to you. They are not our voice. We just saw Glenn in late February in Clarion, behind closed doors, holding what he described as a town hall meeting. You had to be a Republican. You had to be vetted. You were not allowed to take notes, and you were not allowed to carry cameras or any recording device in. I'm not sure I would consider that an open town hall. But at that meeting, we snuck a Republican who is in favor of our cause through the door, and inside that meeting he said, we are coming after Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. That's our next step. And I'll tell you this, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, any politician who thinks they can go after that is criminal. That is not money the federal government gets to play with, reduce, or move. That is money we have all paid in with the promissory note that we hold that it will be there for the future. For him or any other politician to go after that money is no different than me walking into the bank with a ski mask and a gun. We have to say no. We have to protect it.